Hello everyone, I recently made 5 custom Super Mario Bros. Wonder break time levels, and today I want to talk about how and why I did that. Normally for these kinds of videos I record time-lapse footage of the process of making the level, but because of how bite-sized break times are, I decided to do things a bit differently this time. So I'm going to talk about and show each of the levels in the order that I made them, whilst mostly relying on in-game footage. The first break time I made is called Kerpop Potshots. If you're a fan of my custom levels, you may have noticed how most of the break times I made are very much tied to the gimmicks and theming of one of my earlier custom levels. So this break time is an expansion upon ideas I played with in Sizzlin' Shoom Shoot, mostly because of the use of this custom purple Kerpop variant that doesn't move horizontally. As I discovered in the process of working on that level, not only is it possible to launch Kerpops by shooting them with a fireball, but the player can also get a lot of height from this by jumping off of the Kerpop right after it's been hit. The reason I didn't actually use this idea in Sizzlin' Shoom Shoot is because I don't like designing bonus rooms or secrets or anything that only work if the player happens to have the right power-up equipped. But this kind of design quirk is fine for a break time level, so that's why this thing came to be. Although some of the original game's break times are hilariously short, I felt that just forcing the player to do a single Kerpop launch jump wouldn't be enough to carry the whole thing. So that's why, in order to collect the Wonder Seed, the player has to go back and hit a Kerpop twice in one jump to allow you to bounce on it from much higher up. The reason I spawned these kinda random cloud platforms during this part is that without them, if the player were to get a Kerpop up to this point and then fall back down to the start, they'd be stuck because there'd be no Kerpop to jump on to get back up. So this is kind of an inelegant solution to that problem, but I don't think there was a less complex way of fixing it. Anyways, let's move on to Skedaddler Herding. This break time is even more of a straightforward expansion of one of my previous level's ideas, since Skeblaster Scurry already features a bonus room that makes use of the exact same concept of making a Skedaddler run away from you to allow it to navigate a small puzzle platforming section. But what made me interested in reusing this idea for a break time was combining it with the green linking lift blocks that I used in Rumba Bumble. The main challenge of designing this section was the extremely limited vertical space I had to deal with, because for some reason I decided against just zooming out the camera a bit. So although ahead of time I had a lot of ideas for more complex setups that the Skedaddler could interact with, in the end the bridging and platforming down below turned out kinda simple and repetitive. Probably my favorite little thing in the level is the part where the Skedaddler causes a block to move over to the player's side, and jumping on top of it moves up the camera, allowing you to see a block that can be sent back to the Skedaddler, at which point the camera moves back down. Instead of relying on the game's automatic camera movement to handle this, which wouldn't have worked nearly as seamlessly, I implemented this by tying a scroll limit to an actor that can move up and down when a signal is triggered, and said signal is activated when the player stands on top of the block, and then disabled the moment the other block is sent off, meaning the camera only pans up so long as there's actually a reason for it to do so. I put a talking flower at the very end of the section that will congratulate the player once they get the Skedaddler over there, but I realized it would be kind of awkward if the player went over here before completing the challenge, so I made sure the talking flower references that in case you get here early. Alright, now let's talk about Puffy Peril. I suppose this break time is another one that combines two mechanics I've used in two of my older levels, the Lakitu trio from Spiny Spires, and Puffy lifts from Conk Crew's Charge. Though thematically it doesn't really resemble either of those levels, since I used this Desert Clouds level theme to match the yellow Puffy lifts and Spike Balls. My original idea for this break time was to have the player ride a set of Puffy lifts that slowly move to the right, and maybe the Lakitu trio would just be one of the many obstacles you'd encounter. However, that idea went out the window as soon as I learned that Puffy lifts don't really work properly when moved, so I had to find a way to make an engaging section out of static Puffy platforms. I considered just making this a straight up survival section, so the player had to wait and dodge the spike balls to survive for like 30 seconds, and then the Wonder Seed would spawn, but not only would that probably not make for the most thrilling gameplay, but I also had no idea how to indicate the timer in such a setup. Quite a few of the original game's break times revolve around collecting Wonder Tokens, and I realized spawning these one after the other would be a good way of forcing the player to run around the Puffy lifts for a bit. The funny thing is that, by complete coincidence, this made this section very similar to the Lakitu Trio Wonder effect in Spiny Spires, since that also features Wonder Tokens to collect, though I think the sections are different enough besides that to where that isn't a deal breaker. By far the biggest problem I had designing this section was making the raining spike balls feel fair and balanced. My original plan was to have them fall straight down without the second layer of Puffy lifts, but that proved way too difficult to deal with because the player only has like half a second to react to any given spike ball. I toyed with other ideas like putting moving blocks up here, or even trying to find a way to edit the quantity of spike balls the Lakitus throw, but putting more Puffy lifts up above proved to be the most seamless compromise. Though even in the finished level, because of the way the spike balls sometimes do or don't roll into each other and break before they've reached the second layer of Puffy lifts, the amount of spike balls the player has to deal with is extremely inconsistent and sometimes still quite overbearing. But despite my best efforts, I haven't found a way of making the spike balls consistently manageable, so for now this setup is the best I've got. Anyways, now it's time to talk about the slice. After the first 3 break times I made ended up being kinda simplistic and vanilla, I wanted to do something a bit more elaborate for the last 2 I was planning on making. At this point I was still attached to the idea of basing the break times on mechanics I'd used in previous custom levels, so I decided to make one that uses the bindable sloped lava I made for, once again, Sizzlin' Shoom Shoot. Though in order to make it visually distinct, I decided to use the factory level theme and the accompanying green and purple lava color, which was only possible because the original game also features a lava slope in that style. My initial plan for the level's layout was that the player would have to navigate a spiral-shaped corridor from the center to the edge, whilst being chased by a rotating lava slope that covers half the screen. However, after testing it out, I decided that didn't really work that well for a variety of reasons, so I switched to the idea of having 2 lava slopes with a slice of playable space in between that would rotate as the player explores a small open area to collect Wonder Tokens. Whereas implementing the Wonder Tokens in Puffy Peril was a breeze, it took a lot of thought and playtesting to fine-tune the implementation of the Wonder Tokens into this break time, since the constantly rotating lava made it hard to set up unique challenges for the player that wouldn't feel unfair during a first playthrough. I also really wanted to preserve the surprise of there being all this stuff to explore in the lava below and above you at the start of the level, so I had to make sure most of the gimmicks and platforms were completely hidden at that point. I originally designed this level to have the camera be zoomed out to show the entire thing at once, but I ended up reverting the zoom to its original state for a variety of reasons. Not only was it kinda hard to track the player's movement with the camera at nearly twice its usual size, but I also think seeing this much of the lava material just looks kinda ugly. And either way, allowing the player to see the entire level all at once really doesn't accomplish anything, so yeah, I'm glad I scrapped that idea. The final tweak I made to this break time is that instead of using the vanilla factory background, I made this custom background wall asset that lights up and rotates along with the lava. This wasn't something I'd planned on making beforehand, but honestly I wasn't super happy with the level in its original state, and somehow adding this one purely visual detail really tied things together. This wall is a duplicate of one of the rotating temple disc background pieces that appears in the original game, and in terms of visuals, I made it by putting together several assets that are used in one of the airship levels. Alright, last but not least, it's time to discuss Handy House. Basically nothing about this break time has anything to do with the custom levels I've made previously, and I'm also not planning on making a full level with the custom hands gimmick in the future. In case you're not aware, the idea of making white gloves that point at the location of moving invisible blocks isn't something I came up with myself. This is actually a reference to a room that appears in one of the ghost houses in New Super Mario Bros. I guess for some reason this cryptic area randomly filled with floating white hands that relate to a puzzle that used to boggle my mind really left an impression on me as a kid, so I wanted to recreate it in Wonder. The way I did that is by putting a custom bindable invisible block onto a rail using a rail movement controller, which sends out a signal when it's hit, which in turn deletes the controller, causing the block to be static. As for the hand, it's hooked up to a swaying movement controller, which also gets deleted once the block is activated. And for each setup I had to do a bit of maths to figure out the exact speed and angle of the hand's rotation to make it always match the movement of the block. Also, because of how limited Wonder's swaying movement controller is, I couldn't think of a way to make a hand track a block from a position that isn't roughly centered relative to the block's average position. So that's why I didn't replicate the way the original DS level featured loads of hands all tracking the same block. As for the hand itself, I actually took this glove from Mario's player model and manually rearranged one of the fingers to make it point and smoothed out some of its rough edges. When importing it, I gave it a subtle custom bobbing animation, which was surprisingly easy to implement. The original DS hands bob up and down more noticeably when the block is right below them, but I couldn't think of a way of replicating that without it probably looking extremely janky. As for the actual level, the creation process of Handy House was extremely straightforward. Just like in the Kerpop level, this one progresses vertically and escalates the main mechanic in a new and interesting way with every subsequent floor. Once when playtesting the level, this copycat died by, I guess, getting crushed by the invisible block right as it was triggered, but I haven't been able to replicate that since, so I suppose it's not that big of a deal. Making the camera move over very smoothly like this when the player uses the doors basically took a more complicated version of that setup I talked about in the Skedaddler level, but I'll spare you the details. Finally, I might as well mention that this level technically features a bit of a custom background. The original game's ghost house doesn't really feature any verticality whatsoever, meaning its background also wasn't made to stretch upwards. So for this break time I made a custom extended background wall that can be placed above the original game's assets. Anyways, there we go, that's all of the custom break time levels covered. Normally at this point after a time-lapse I would do a playthrough of the level to talk about it some more, but I feel like I've pretty much said everything I wanted to say about these things, considering they're all super short. So yeah, that's actually gonna do it for this video. I guess maybe let me know how you feel about this slightly different format by leaving a comment. While you're down there, you could also consider leaving a like, or subscribing, or checking out my public Discord server, or signing up for a YouTube channel membership to support the channel and get early access to upcoming videos. Thank you so much for watching, and bye bye!